So my goal is to give an overview of the disagreement between gender critical and trans activist beliefs. And let me just flag this by saying, as you see here on the slide, I'm drawing on these two sources for the overview that I'm going to be giving, but I am the author of both sources. Let's start with gender critical beliefs, and here you just have an image of sort of around the start of the second wave in Sydney on International Women's Day, and you see that some of the feminist activists here are referring to sex role concept, which is going to be crucial to the gender critical view, although under different terminology. So here's just a list of the claims as they appeared in my book, Sex Matters, that you see pictured here on the left. Just to keep track more easily of this list of claims, I've sort of grouped them into themes. So the first set of claims are claims about biological sex, the nature of biological sex. These include there are two sexes, male and female, that it is impossible to change your sex, that sex characteristics cluster into a bimodal distribution, and intersex people are not outside of those two main clusters, that trans women are male and trans men are female, and if they weren't, they wouldn't be trans, and then finally that sex is not gender identity, that these are two distinct concepts and that we could make a sex-gender identity distinction. The second set of claims are claims about gender as a concept. So the first of these, that gender is not gender identity. So just as we could make a sex gender identity distinction, we can also make a gender identity distinction. The second, that gender is sex caste, or some would prefer sex class, by way of gender norms that are, and these are explained by or built on top of sex difference. Third claim, that gender as previously defined, so gender as gender norms built on top of sex difference, should be abolished. So we are, or some of us are, gender abolitionists. And then final claim, everyone is non-binary relative to this previous definition of gender, and therefore no one is. Third set of claims are claims about sex and gender terms, so claims about the language that we use to refer to these concepts or things in the world. And these include that the terms female and male should refer to sex, the terms woman and man, girl and boy should refer to either or both of sex and gender as previously defined, and that lesbian and gay are sexual orientations and thus refer to and depend on sex. And then final set of claims are political claims. So the first, the assertion that sex matters politically and women's sex-based rights should be protected. The second, that female-only spaces, services, and provisions are important to women and girls and so should not be offered on the basis of self-identified sex or gender identity, where these are distinct. Third claim, that self-identification statutorily declared is an inadequate basis for legal sex, which means there's opposition to so-called self-ID policies in law. And then finally, that a subjective sense of one's identity doesn't trump all other people's interests when there are conflict cases. Okay, so that's the list of gender critical claims. Now moving on to the trans activist claims, and here you just have an image from a trans solidarity protest earlier this year in London. And again, in the source where I'm taking these from, which was the GenSpect first draft, version 1 draft of the gender framework, I'd organized these under slightly different headings as you see here, but just to keep them consistent with what I've just done in terms of headings for the gender critical beliefs. I'm just rewriting some of those headings. So this is just of interest if someone has come across the claims in the GenSpect document. So again, you can group into claims about biological sex, about gender as a concept, about terms, and then the political claims down the bottom of both boxes. And you see that there's just like a very straightforward disagreement here. Sex is not binary, so there are more than two. That intersex people do prove that sex is not binary, that the sex binary is a social construction rather than something real in the world, that sex is not an essential property of a person, so it can be changed. So direct contradiction of the gender critical claim that sex cannot be changed. It can be changed on this view through surgical, medical, legal, or social interventions. and that the way we identify or figure out our own sex/gender is through introspection. So it's the same sort of process as the one by which we learn our sexual orientations. Let me end on the political claims, so jump over to the right column now. Claims about the gender concept. Here, gender means gender identity, and there's a sort of denial that any other relevant gender concept exists. So you get a serious tension here because the gender critical concept of gender differs from gender identity, and the trans activists are claiming that gender is gender identity and there's no other concept. So they're effectively denying the gender critical gender concept. And then also sex means gender identity, or in the cases where sex is countenanced in some form, at least there's an insistence that gender identity replaces or displaces sex, that it's the more important thing. Then a bunch of claims about terms as well that are again kind of in direct tension with the gender critical claims. On this set of views, the terms man and woman refer to gender identity. The terms male and female similarly refer to gender identity. Therefore, trans women are women and female, trans men are men and male, and non-binary people belong to none of those categories. So they're not woman, female, man, or male. The terms boy and girl refer to gender identity. The terms mother, wife, sister, girlfriend, lady, lesbian, etc., all refer to gender identity. You get the point. And then finally, the sexual orientation terms, where these have been traditionally thought of as referring to or depending on sex, they now refer to gender orientations. And the consequence of that is that males can be lesbians and females can be gay men. Okay, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, the disagreement over the political claims. So for the trans activists, biological sex, if it's countenanced at all, as we see it sometimes isn't, is at least not as relevant as gender identity. The thing that really matters is a person's self-determined gender identity or his or her legal sex or social sex. Self-identification statutorily declared is sufficient to determine one's legal sex category. So what's colloquially referred to as self-ID is supported on this view. Women-only spaces and services, where they were previously thought to be for biological females, should now be accessible to anyone with a gender identity of woman or female, or a female legal sex classification. There is no conflict of interest between sex and gender identity, but if there is, gender identity takes precedence because it's more central to the individual. And then there's a kind of claim about authority or deference here. Because of this earlier claim that we learn our sex/gender through introspection, that makes every individual the ultimate authority on what sex or gender they are. And that means that other people should therefore defer to their own claims about what their sex/gender identification is. And then just jumping over to the final of the political claims, it is erasing a person's existence to notice their sex when they have a gender identity. So, for example, to notice that a trans woman is a biological male or that a trans man is female. And then finally, because gender in this conception as identity is so important to transgender people, we should not be gender abolitionists. That is, we should not be people who seek to eradicate enculturation into femininity on the basis of female sex and enculturation into masculinity on the basis of male sex. Because gender identity depends conceptually on gender, in order to affirm gender identity, we must, in the end, retain gender. So summary of disagreements. There's a disagreement over biological sex, obviously. There's a disagreement over what gender is, so which concept of gender is the most relevant, important, interesting, correct, useful concept. There's a disagreement over what the sex and gender terms refer to. And these disagreements result in disagreement over whether and when trans people should be treated as their sex. And again, that's to put things in the gender critical language, so to put them in the trans activist language, when and whether people should be treated in accordance with their sex assigned at birth. And that too results in disagreements about what even counts as transphobia or what would count as discrimination against a trans person. And the particular disagreement here is whether it's only mistreatment or discrimination against a trans person in virtue of being trans, or it's also counting as discrimination or mistreatment not to treat a trans woman as any other female person is treated, or a trans man as any other male person is treated. Okay, and there are sort of practical conflicts resulting from this disagreement between gender critical beliefs and trans activist beliefs, showing up in three main application areas. So one is when it comes to children. So there's conflict over gender affirming medical care, as it tends to be called. So the medical, social, and surgical transition of minors. There's conflicts with women, and in particular, these center around questions of access to female-only spaces, services, and provisions. So think about things like who has the right to compete in women's sport. And there are also implications here to do with what the political project of feminism even is. Because one of the things that's at issue is the kind of what's the correct conception of gender to settle who is a woman. So how we think about gender and how we use gender terms is going to have implications for what our project is when we're working for women's equality or women's liberation, for example. And then the third kind of conflict area is conflict with lesbian, gay, and bisexual or LGB people. So similar issues arise as they do for women when it comes to spaces. So think about something like a gay sauna. But also similarly to feminism, there are implications for the political project of gay rights activism and exactly what issues are on its agenda.